I didn't plan on freezing out an entire neighborhood. Honestly, if the Whitmore Ridge HOA had just left me alone, none of this would have happened. But when somebody cuts power to your home in the middle of a North Dakota winter, when it's 15 below outside and your front door is literally frozen shut, you stop thinking about being the reasonable guy real fast. You start thinking about survival, and survival makes people remember things. In my case, it made me remember something my grandfather built back in 1968, something buried 6 feet underground beneath 43 luxury homes full of people who couldn't stand the sight of my old fifth-wheel camper parked on family land they wished they owned. My name's Cole Mercer. I'm 36, licensed electrical contractor, born and raised outside Bismarck, and for the last 2 years I'd been living in a custom RV setup on 40 inherited acres my grandfather bought before any of these gated communities even existed. The funny part is, I actually liked my neighbors at first, or at least I tried to. I waved when they drove by in their Escalades and Range Rovers, kept my property clean, fixed fences after storms, even helped one guy jumpstart his BMW during a blizzard. Didn't matter. To them, I was the trailer guy. You could feel it every time they slowed down near my driveway, every time their wives stared a little too long while pretending not to stare. Whitmore Ridge had these giant stone entrance signs with fake lanterns and little pine trees wrapped in Christmas lights all winter long, like some Hallmark movie for rich people, and right in the middle of all that curated perfection sat my silver RV with solar panels and a work truck beside it. Apparently that was enough to offend the local royalty. The queen bee of the whole circus was Diane Holloway, HOA president, late 50s, permanent Botox smile, drove a white Mercedes G-Wagon like she was campaigning for office every day of her life. Diane loved rules the way certain people love religion. Grass height, mailbox paint, holiday decorations, driveway appearance. She treated the HOA handbook like the Constitution. And for months she'd been trying to force me out. First, it was visual noncompliance, then temporary structure violations, then complaints that my RV disrupted community winter aesthetics. Yeah, winter aesthetics. Because nothing says civilization like threatening a man over a parked camper while there's 3 feet of snow outside. I ignored most of it because legally they couldn't touch me. My property predated the HOA by decades, and my grandfather had protected the land with old easement language most people wouldn't even understand. Diane hated that. You could see it in her face every time we crossed paths. Then came January 14th, coldest week of the year. Wind chill around -30. I came back from a 12-hour electrical job and noticed something weird immediately. No lights. No heater hum. No glow from the inverter panel. At first I thought the generator tripped, but when I walked around the side of the RV, my stomach dropped. The electrical disconnect box had a bright yellow padlock on it, and zip-tied to the handle was an HOA violation notice flapping in the wind like a damn victory flag. Final enforcement action. They'd shut off my power. Not the city. Not the utility company. The HOA. I remember just standing there in the snow staring at it while the wind cut through my jacket. I could actually hear the pipes groaning inside the RV from the cold. I ripped the notice off and called Diane immediately. She answered on the second ring, almost like she'd been waiting for it. Calm voice, smug voice. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "you were given multiple notices regarding prohibited residential appearance violations." I said, "You shut off my electricity in below-zero weather. Are you out of your damn mind?" And she actually laughed, not loud, just this little fake country club laugh. Then she said the sentence I still remember word for word. "Maybe now you'll finally understand that Whitmore Ridge has standards." Standards. Meanwhile, I'm standing in a frozen driveway looking at my home turning into an icebox. Inside the RV, it was 42 degrees and dropping. By midnight, one of the water lines burst underneath the kitchen sink. By morning, 2 more followed. I spent the next 6 hours with numb fingers cutting damaged pipe, while diesel heaters struggled to keep the place above freezing. Repair estimate? $2,300. That was the moment something changed in me. Because up until then, I still thought this was just HOA harassment, annoying rich people with too much free time. But sitting there at 3 in the morning wrapped in a welding blanket while ice formed inside my windows, I realized Diane didn't want compliance. She wanted humiliation. She wanted me gone because my existence ruined the fantasy version of the neighborhood she sold to herself every morning in the mirror. And right about then, I remembered the old concrete utility vault near the North Tree Line. The one my grandfather used to check every winter before he died. The one connected to a steel pipeline nobody in Whitmore Ridge had ever bothered asking about, because rich people rarely ask where comfort comes from. They just assume it'll always be there. Now let me pause the story for a second because this is where people online usually split into two groups. The burn the HOA down crowd, and the there's no way this is legal crowd. And honestly, both sides miss the bigger picture. According to standard procedure, most HOAs actually have pretty limited authority once utilities enter the conversation. They can fine you, threaten liens, drag you into civil court over appearance violations, sure, but physically interfering with essential services during dangerous weather conditions? That's where things start getting real ugly, real fast. Especially in northern states where freezing temperatures can turn property damage into a safety issue overnight. From a legal perspective, Diane made the kind of mistake that happens when small amounts of power sit in the hands of people who've never been told no. See, HOA boards attract certain personalities, not always bad people, but people who feel emotionally rewarded by control. This is a psychological trap because once someone starts viewing a neighborhood like their personal kingdom, every disagreement feels like rebellion instead of negotiation. And when somebody like me refused to fold, refused to apologize, refused to act embarrassed for living differently than they did, Diane took that personally. The RV wasn't really the problem. I was. I represented something she couldn't regulate, independence. And here's the funny thing most people don't realize about wealthy suburban communities: the infrastructure underneath them is often older than the people living there. Roads, easements, buried utility access, handshake agreements from 50 years ago. Half the time nobody even checks who owns what until there's a crisis. My grandfather came from that old-school generation where men settled things with coffee and trust instead of contracts. Back in the 60s, he'd allowed neighboring lots to tap into a private natural gas feeder line crossing our land because, at the time, everybody knew everybody. No HOA, no gated entrances, no community standards committee, just ranch land and families trying to survive winters. But decades later, those handshakes became legal gray areas, and legal gray areas become very dangerous when arrogant people start pushing too hard. The lesson here is simple. Never assume the quiet guy with the old property is powerless just because he doesn't brag. Sometimes the person everybody looks down on is the one holding the shutoff valve nobody even knows exists. The next morning, I called my attorney before I touched anything. That part matters. People hear stories like this and imagine some revenge fantasy where a guy snaps and starts turning valves like a movie villain, but I wasn't trying to go to prison over an HOA feud. I wanted facts. So I drove into town, carrying this dusty metal document box my grandfather kept in his workshop for years, and inside were old permits, hand-drawn maps, utility sketches, even handwritten maintenance notes from the 70s. My lawyer, Frank Delaney, looked through everything for almost 2 hours before leaning back in his chair and giving me this slow little grin. "Cole," he said, "do you understand what you've got here?" Turns out the private gas feeder line servicing Whitmore Ridge wasn't owned by the city utility company at all. It originated from a commercial junction near the county highway, crossed directly through our family land, then split into distribution branches feeding 43 separate homes built decades later during development expansion. And the craziest part? There was never a transfer agreement. No easement transfer. No municipal acquisition. No service contract. The developers just connected to it. Legally, ownership stayed with the Mercer property, including the emergency shutoff vault sitting behind my grandfather's old equipment shed. Frank looked at me and said, "If you interfere maliciously, that's one thing. But if you suspend unauthorized private access pending formal agreement negotiations, that's civil territory." Then he paused and added, "Especially after they interfered with your utilities first." Man, hearing that felt like somebody handing me the nuclear launch codes. But honestly, I still hesitated. Because revenge sounds fun until real families get involved. Kids, elderly people, folks who probably had no idea their HOA president was playing dictator with somebody else's electricity. So I sat in my truck for almost an hour staring at that utility map while snow drifted across the windshield, trying to decide whether Diane deserved to learn this lesson the hard way. Then my phone buzzed. Another HOA violation email. Failure to remove non-compliant dwelling structure within 14 days may result in legal seizure proceedings. That did it. Around noon, I drove out to the concrete vault near the tree. It was half buried in snow, same as always. Heavy steel lid rusted around the edges. I remember kneeling there with insulated gloves while freezing wind cut across the field, hearing my grandfather's voice in the back of my head telling me, "Never let anybody bully you off your own land." I opened the vault. There it was. Main shutoff wheel. Thick steel pipeline humming beneath the ground. 43 homes, depending on one mechanical turn. I stood there for maybe 10 seconds, then slowly rotated the valve closed. You want to know the weirdest part? Nothing dramatic happened immediately. No explosions. No alarms. Just silence. Quiet snow. Quiet wind. Quiet fields. But about 20 minutes later, my phone started blowing up. First one call. Then 5. Then 12. By 4 p.m., the Whitmore Ridge Community Facebook page looked like a digital riot. Does anyone else have no heat? Gas pressure failure? Furnace emergency? Has the utility company been contacted? I ignored all of it. Instead, I mailed 43 certified envelopes prepared earlier that afternoon by Frank's office. Inside each one was a formal utility access agreement. Monthly infrastructure lease fee, $350. Winter service term, October through March. 15-year minimum contract. Immediate reimbursement for my property damages. Permanent removal of RV restrictions from HOA bylaws. Failure to comply would result in continued suspension of private utility access pending legal resolution. Cold. Absolutely. But after what they did to me, I was past caring about appearances. By sunset, outside temperatures dropped below zero. That's when the panic started getting real. Portable heaters sold out at the local hardware stores in under 2 hours. Families started checking into motels along Interstate 94. One guy named Randall Pierce, investment banker, always acted like shaking my hand physically hurt him, showed up pounding on my RV door around 8 o'clock screaming that his hardwood floors were cracking from the cold. I opened the door just enough to look at him and said, "Sounds expensive." The look on his face, man. He realized right then the social hierarchy had flipped completely upside down. By midnight, emergency vehicles were entering the subdivision. Elderly residents couldn't maintain safe temperatures. One woman slipped carrying space heaters across an icy driveway. Carbon monoxide alarms started going off because people were using propane equipment indoors trying to stay warm. And Diane? Oh, Diane was still trying to bluff. She sent out an HOA mass email threatening lawsuits, criminal charges, intentional utility sabotage, all kinds of dramatic nonsense. Problem was, the county inspector showed up the next morning. Apparently, somebody from the fire department started asking questions about private gas infrastructure permits. Turns out Whitmore Ridge never properly documented half the distribution modifications added during expansion phases, which meant insurance companies immediately smelled blood in the water. By day 2, the entire neighborhood atmosphere changed from annoyance to fear. Real fear. Temperatures dropped to -8 with wind chills around -25. I drove through Whitmore Ridge that afternoon, and it looked like a disaster movie. Condensation frozen on windows. Families loading luggage into SUVs. Kids wrapped in blankets sitting inside idling cars. One house had 3 industrial generators outside humming like aircraft engines. Another had plumbers carrying out sections of burst copper pipe. Then I saw Diane standing outside the clubhouse screaming at 2 board members in fur-lined boots, while local police watched nearby. She looked exhausted. Makeup running. Hair messy. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked human instead of polished. And honestly, that almost made me feel bad. Almost. Around 6 p.m., local news crews arrived. Apparently, luxury subdivision loses heat during winter dispute was too juicy to ignore. They filmed frozen driveways, interviewed angry residents, showed footage of emergency crews checking homes. One reporter even stood outside my property, trying to bait me into commenting. I just smiled and said, "Private contractual disagreement. No further statement." That clip aired all over the county that night. Diane called me at 8:17 p.m. I remember the exact time because I stared at the phone for a full minute before answering. Her voice sounded completely different now. Softer. Careful. Gone was the queen of the neighborhood attitude. "Cole," she said, "we need to find a compromise. I actually laughed when she said compromise because people only start loving compromise once they lose leverage. I told her there would be no negotiation. The contract stood exactly as written, plus one additional condition: permanent voting seat on the HOA board with full veto authority over property use disputes involving legacy landowners. Long silence. Then she said, "You're enjoying this?" And I answered honestly, "No, I'm finishing it." Another silence. Then she asked how long they had. I looked outside at snow blowing across the field and said, "Forecast says -15 by midnight. You've got 6 hours." She hung up without another word. Those next few hours were chaos. Absolute chaos. Residents turned on each other. 3 HOA board members resigned before 10 p.m. Insurance adjusters started denying emergency claims connected to undocumented utility systems. Lawsuit rumors spread everywhere. By 11 p.m., trucks started arriving at my property one after another. Homeowners carrying signed contracts, certified checks, some angry, some embarrassed, some refusing to even make eye contact. A few apologized quietly. One older guy actually shook my hand and said, "Your grandfather would have been disappointed in all of us." That one hit harder than I expected. At exactly 11:47 p.m., Frank confirmed all 43 agreements were executed, notarized, and legally binding. The HOA bylaws had been amended electronically. RV restrictions permanently removed. Damage reimbursement delivered in full. I put on my coat, grabbed a flashlight, and walked back out to the utility vault one last time. Snow was falling harder now, thick sideways wind sweeping across the property. My boots crunched through ice while the entire neighborhood sat in darkness and tension behind me. I opened the steel lid, reached down, and slowly turned the valve open again. About 30 seconds later, you could hear it. First distant clicks, then furnace ignitions, then the deep mechanical hum of heating systems roaring back to life across Whitmore Ridge like some giant sleeping animal waking up underground. House by house, window by window, warmth returning. I just stood there breathing steam into the freezing air listening to it happen. Then headlights rolled slowly past my driveway. Diane's Mercedes. She looked over at me through the window while creeping down the road. Didn't wave, didn't smile, didn't say a word. And honestly, neither did I. I went back inside my RV, kicked snow off my boots, turned on the coffee maker, and sat beside the heater while warm air filled the room again. Outside it was -15. Inside it was 72 degrees. Funny how peace and power sometimes sound exactly the same. Here's the thing nobody really talks about when these HOA stories blow up online. People love revenge right up until they imagine themselves on the losing side of it. And honestly, I get that. Because if you strip away all the drama, all the frozen pipes and screaming board meetings and legal threats, what this whole mess was really about was pride. Mine too, not just Diane's. Pride turns neighborhoods into battlefields faster than money ever will. The second people stop seeing each other as neighbors and start seeing each other as obstacles, everything gets ugly real fast. According to standard procedure, communities are supposed to function through cooperation. Rules exist to protect property values, safety, shared living spaces, not to become weapons for personal ego trips. But the problem is, power changes flavor depending on who holds it. Give decent people authority, and they usually try to keep things stable. Give insecure people authority, and suddenly every mailbox, every parked vehicle, every slightly different lifestyle starts feeling like a threat to their control. That's why HOA conflicts get so emotional. It's rarely about the actual rule. It's about identity, about status, about somebody deciding, consciously or not, people like you don't belong around people like us. And once that mindset takes root, compromise becomes almost impossible because nobody's arguing over a camper anymore. They're fighting over who gets to define the neighborhood itself. From a legal perspective, Whitmore Ridge made the same mistake a lot of modern developments make. They assumed old systems didn't matter because old people were gone. But history has teeth sometimes. Land records matter. Easements matter. Forgotten infrastructure matters. A handshake from 1968 can still wreck a $1 million subdivision if nobody bothered checking the paperwork. This is a psychological trap wealthy communities fall into all the time. Comfort creates entitlement. Entitlement creates blindness. And blindness makes people underestimate quiet individuals they think are beneath them. Diane looked at me and saw a guy in an RV. She never stopped to ask why my family owned half the utility corridor under her neighborhood. The lesson here is simple. Never mistake somebody's lifestyle for their level of power. Some people look rich and own nothing. Some people look ordinary and quietly hold the keys to the entire machine. And maybe the bigger lesson is this. If you have power over other people's lives, whether it's an HOA board, management position, city permit office, whatever, use it carefully. Because the moment authority becomes humiliation, eventually somebody pushes back. Sometimes in court, sometimes in public, and sometimes in the middle of winter when the furnaces suddenly stop running. Anyway, that's my story. I still live on the property, still in the RV actually, though now nobody says a damn word about it when they drive by. Diane resigned 6 months later. Last I heard, she moved to Arizona, which honestly feels appropriate for somebody who lost a war against winter. But I want to hear from you. What's the craziest HOA or neighbor conflict you've ever seen? And more importantly, if somebody deliberately messed with your home the way they did mine, would you have handled it differently, or would you have turned that valve too?